So our next speaker is Dr. Jan Vrhovski, who is a research fellow at the Department of Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. His research interests include intellectual history of modern China, history of analytic philosophy, mathematical logic, history of philosophy of science in China, and the international history of mathematics. His current book projects include the Science and Metaphysics Debate, forthcoming with Berlin this year, and also the Calgary Handbook of the History of Analytic Philosophy in China, forthcoming 2025. Super excited because very difficult to find anyone working on Russell in China in the world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jan Vrhovski.
Well, I must first admit that I'm really terrified to be here amongst you as an odd one out, working as a sinologist working on analytic philosophy, which is a rare combination, I'm told. But exactly this question, exactly this rare combination, is what I think makes my speech about Russell today necessary. Because I believe, and I may be wrong, I probably am wrong, but the reason for the scarcity of scholarship on Russell and China today pertains to the fact that our sinological tradition in the West follows a certain branch of consistent scholarship, which does not include 20th century and analytic philosophy. So today I'm going to talk about the historiographical aspect of Russell's encounter with China and China's encounter with Russell, which is far more important in my scholarship at least. I have titled my talk China's Russell Paradox because I maintain that the encounters between Russell and China were actually full of misunderstanding. It works well. So, because of the special nature of this symposium, I have to try to somehow include my historical narrative into the context of your discussion of Julia's project, of your understanding even of how analytical philosophy and modern intellectual history of China fits into what you are working on. And I shall try to do so by presenting a general narrative of intellectual encounters, which I detect within the context between Russell and the Chinese in the 1920s and 1930s. Sorry. The main question for me shall be, how did the Chinese intellectuals understand Russell thought, and how did Russell understand China? Well, on the second part, I do not possess so much information. I'm not so knowledgeable about Russell's private thoughts about China, Russell's communication of what he knew about China to his peers, to his friends, to his colleagues. I know a little bit, and we can hopefully speak about it soon. But I'm more interested in how the Chinese intellectuals understood Russell, how they understood the importance of Russell's philosophy in 1920s and 1930s, because I have a strange intuition that this may have influenced how Europe perceived China in 1920s and 30s. Because aside from sinological work, and aside from missionary proselytizing, work done by church and Protestant communities, in the 1920s, 1930s, the most populous community of Chinese scholars in the West were students. Students and exchange professors who were deeply immersed into the intellectual scene of China in 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. And that's why I think we get results like, if you want to study Chinese philosophy, you should study Confucianism, because it was actually circulated, the same idea in Chinese intellectual discourse. Of course, the influence goes much deeper. But now to the main methodological aspect of my my talk, my historiographical narrative of what was going on in 1920s and 1930s. The keyword of my talk is obviously misunderstanding. I'm not sure whether this is the right word to choose. The question is, how does the notion of misunderstanding affect my current knowledge about the Chinese, the encounters between China and Russell, and how misunderstanding could help me understand the context of introduction of Russell's idea to China. But let's tentatively stick with this notion of misunderstanding. In historiographical account, they can be, at least I thought of, two different options of how approach towards misunderstanding. One is diachronic, so as to say, let us now take a look at how the Chinese understood Russell's idea and locate misunderstanding there. And misunderstanding would be incompatibility of definition of terms, and at a secondary level, implications of certain terms. And then we can go to thought and contexts and cosmologies, etc. But in historiography, in particular, the primary aim should be, I think, in my narrative, to shed some light on misunderstanding as a lack of consensus between two different sides. You should see what I will talk about in this regard. I will not reveal the essence of my talk right now. On the other hand, synchronically, when we think about misunderstanding now, it has got certain use, intellectual use, in our current discourse. So, the analysis of misunderstanding in historiography, intercultural misunderstanding, has got a certain pragmatic effect which can shape sinology at present, can shape how China is taught at present, or how the West is taught by China at present. Aside from the tracing of misunderstanding in historical narrative about, say, 1920s China, there is also another important aspect of delving back into history, of understanding of between Russell and China, which is related to history of ideas. By, say, comparing different translations, translations in literal sense, translations of books, or interpretations of, say, Russell's ideas, we can see that we can trace the terms which were homonymously identical on each side and try to decode deeper into the context and try to find out where we could seemingly speak about adoption or emulation, but on the other hand, in reality, there was much more going on. One thing with the historiography of 1920s and 30s in China is that we tend to think that there was a lot of emulation going on at the time. The Chinese were simply copy-pasting everything. This is a general prejudice about modern Chinese intellectual history. But by analyzing deeper into context of how Russell's idea moved from one, say, from one institution even, or from one author to the other, we can start understanding that it was not a process of emulation, but a process of intellectual adoption, with a lot of analogical reasoning going on. Analogical reasoning in the sense that notions from Russell's philosophy were analogically integrated into the context of the Chinese readers or intellectuals' thought, which is something we are very much missing. So yeah, that was my really difficult methodological introduction. I'm still rather unsure about whether this can be useful in general discourse as well. I try to use these notions which I talked about in my own perspective, but I'm very limited as far as the reality, the pragmatism of my thoughts is concerned. I shall now start with the general introduction to Russell's visit and interaction with the Chinese. So many of you have probably read about or are familiar with the visit of Russell and Dora Black in China in the time between October 1920 and July 1921. Now, it's a humongous story, but what I should say is that initially Russell was expected to be China's new Confucius, in the sense that, like, if you trace articles, if you read talks which were anticipating Russell's visit to China, arrival to China, you can see the people are writing about him as a new Confucius, in the sense that he will supersede the effect and the knowledge which was given to the Chinese before that by American pragmatists. The expectations are he will be better than Dewey. And by New Confucius, they thought that the idea was that Russell is a person combining two different aspects. One is Russell as a scholar, the most advanced scholar in the West, who developed mathematical logic, who understands modern physics, who is the best philosopher in the West. And on the other hand is that he is some sort of a sage, a revolutionary, fighting for righteousness, countering war in the West, etc. And at the same time, speaking about socialism. Now, there was a good background for that, which tallied with Russell's biographical story, biographical background. One was that he was an open speaker for freedom, which was a really important keyword, and the other was that he was an open propagator of open sexual relationships, and that he was against the traditional marriage. So this was one of the most attractive thing in Russell, as seen in the eyes of young Chinese intellectuals. But the background of his visit in China was far more complex than just that, than just a few information about Russell. There were at least three main protagonists behind the invitation of Russell to China. One was Zhang Shenfu. I don't know whether you're familiar with this person, but he's one of the, if you know him, he's one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, who started reading Russell's work in 1914, 1915, by accident, of course. And he was a student of philosophy and mathematics at Beijing Daxue. And as it so happened, Zhang Shenfu was also a keen reader of what he considered to be Marxism, a close friend of Chen Boda, and a librarian at Beijing Daxue. So as early as 1918, Zhang Shenfu started writing about Russell as a revolutionary, Russell as a scholar, one who will definitely help China attain a better future. China, to help her liberate itself from the yokes of the West. He was the one who provided some sort of an intellectual background for the Chinese intellectual circles in Beijing to recognize the importance of inviting Russell to China. Another one was Fu Tong, who is a less known intellectual from that time. He was a graduate of Birmingham University, who graduated with a thesis on criticism of pragmatism in 1917. And after he returned to China, he preached, so to say, against pragmatism and advocated Russellian type of studies of religion. He was one of the people behind the non-religious movement of 1922 and 1923. And the third one was obviously Cai Yuanpei, who was the famous rector of Beijing Daxue at the time, who was all about combining Western idea with Chinese ideas, was all about balancing the curricula at Beijing University. Now, when Russell eventually arrived to China in October 1920, he first lectured about social problems, about reformation of the society, about socialism. And at those lectures, he was more or less well accepted. Those lectures were attended mostly by young socialists, by revolutionaries, and less so by intellectuals and scholars from main Chinese universities. After he arrived to Beijing, he started lecturing on more scholarly topics. He taught about analysis of mind, analysis of matter, and mathematical logic. And there is one really peculiar thing, that his lectures on analysis of mind, which were organized for the Chinese students, had almost no attendance at all, because the Chinese students were so critical about Russell speaking all the time about psychology, when he should speak about matter, he should speak about science and materialism and modern physics. But at the same time, while his ideas were getting dispersed amongst different circles of Chinese modern intelligentsia, there was a certain model arising at the Chinese universities. It was started by a group of lecturers of philosophy at the philosophical department of Beijing University, who started introducing Russell's philosophy. So they started introducing science, scientific methodology into curricula. And this trend started around 1922 and peaked around 1925. But the rise of this trend in the Chinese community was well noted, to the degree that soon an opposition would arise. An opposition which is unfortunately less well known today. And the opposition started brewing at around 1922, when Zhang Dongsun, I hope you are familiar with Zhang Dongsun. Zhang Dongsun actually encountered Russell back in 1920 when he accompanied him on his travel from Shanghai to Beijing. And allegedly they talked a lot about socialism. But after that, Zhang Dongsun started writing prolifically on Russell's philosophy. He actually became the first Chinese critique of Russell's philosophy, and sort of paved the way for the later science and metaphysics controversy of the 1923 and 1924. Now, Zhang Dongsun's work tells us a lot about the intellectual climate in China at that time. It tells us a lot about the perception that on one hand we had scientific philosophy, a philosophy which is closer to Russell, a philosophy associated with dialectical materialism even, and on the other hand we had a philosophy centered on life, closer to Neo-Kantian philosophy in Germany, closer even to Chinese tradition. And the connection was established around 1923, 1924 by Zhang Junmai, who studied under Rudolf Eucken in Germany, in Jena, and he learned from Eucken the current trends in neo-vitalism in Germany, and started integrating Eucken's thought into his own thinking about the rise of scientific philosophy in China and how to counter it, how to preserve the Chinese essence within Chinese academia. Now, 1923 and 1924 controversy is really important in my regard. Although it is, if you look at the content of the texts, of the speeches, of everything which was written at that time, at first glimpse, it appears to us as a sort of emulation of a Western discourse. But it was much more than that. It was, in essence, the first step towards discovering a Chinese voice, China's own continuation of philosophical tradition within Chinese modernity. And the rise of Russell's scientism is an important negative aspect of the discovery of topics like Neo-Confucianism, modern Confucianism in Chinese philosophy. Aside from the concepts, two main concepts which arose in the debate, which is science and metaphysics, intuition, objectivism, subjectivism. An important topic in the debate was actually the relationship between West and East, or West and China within Chinese modernity. And this is the point where Russell's work, which he authored after he returned back to the UK, actually agrees the most. While the Chinese were discussing about what is the right degree to which they should include Western ideas into their own project of modernity, Russell was thinking about the same topic. And Russell's idea of how the Chinese, Russell's understanding of what the main problems of the Chinese contemporary society are was very much dialectical. One of his main misunderstandings was that the nature of Chinese civilization is centered around morality, aesthetics, and nature, while the Western material civilization is centered around industry, capitalism, reason, and militarism. His 1920 book on the problem of China was a call out for saving China's future, to protect China against the dangers of Western civilization. While at the same time, he praised the importance of education and intellectual and practical leadership. Paradoxically, if we take a look at the content of Russell's 1922 on the problem of China, he sides with the current which propagated the view on life rather than science. In other words, he sides with the opponents of those people who were most loudly speaking for Russell in China. And that's the key paradox here. Intellectuals who propagated Russell's philosophy, the importance of analytical philosophy, early analytical philosophy, mathematical logic for China's future, were actually preaching against Russell's philosophy. And they started to realize that relatively soon. In 1924, the Chinese got the first translation of Russell's 1922 work on the problem of China. It was commissioned by Liang Tichao, by one of those people who were closest to the pro-view on life, pro-Chinese tradition current in the 1924 debate. Sorry. And when the Chinese discovered the content of Russell's own work, a sudden change appeared even in the community related to Russell's philosophy. Here we have a rendition of, an analysis of translator's preface to Russell's book from 1924. The person who translated the book says that Russell's assessment of China is not entirely correct at all. So there was this apparent understanding. But at the same time, the most important thing for them was to discover how China can attain an independence which may help to save the Western civilization, which may help to establish a world peace. This was the most important thing noticed by translators and interpreters of Russell's 1922 book in China. A key point here, a key term here is independence. Because somehow independence, due to the context of the debate, split into two different categories. One was material and one was spiritual independence. And spiritual independence was to be traditional, tradition-based. Material independence is the part where science comes into play. Well, before I continue with the Chinese story, I have to take a brief look at what happened with Russell in 1924. We have to keep in mind that Russell was not well acquainted with what was going on in China. Everything he knew about China came through context he established when he was visiting Beijing in 1921. So he was informed through letters by people like Zhang Shunfu. There was one important thing in history of UK public relations with China, which can be dated back to 1924, where the Boxer Indemnity Bill was first proposed by the UK Foreign Office. Russell, of course, saw that it was his duty to interfere and to try to advise the UK government how to use the money, how to disperse the money amongst the Chinese, the different institutions and different needs of the Chinese contemporary society. So he drafted a resolution against it. One of the members of his camp was A.G. Wells, and he also had the British Church on his side as well. And as a result of I have to skip now because it's only 5 minutes till the end. This is one of his letters to a representative of the Foreign Office. He emphasizes that expenditure related to the indemnity bill should go only in the direction of education, not to industry and not everything else. But at the same time, this is a memorandum of 1924. But at the same time, different kind of information start to come from China. The Chinese were only for investing the money into infrastructure. They were not for investments into education. Only later, between 1925 and 1927, when Russell went public, different kind of information started to come from the Chinese side, where the China's Society of Education started to speak up for investing the money into education. This is relatively important for understanding how the Chinese perceived actually their own education at that time, how they understood what were the priorities of the Chinese society at that time, and also it a little bit highlights Russell's involvement and his role in UK and China's relationship. But I actually don't know much about it, about what follows after that. I think I will have to conclude here because otherwise we will.
You just go on. Yeah.
I continue.
Yeah. I don't know how many more slides you have.
There's quite a lot. So I will try to wrap it up here. Yes?
Maybe just explain.
So I will try to wrap it up here. The key misunderstanding, the key paradox which followed after 1925, in the late 1920s, was that due to the institutionalization of Russellian philosophy at universities like Beijing Daxue, Yanjing Daxue, and Tsinghua Daxue, a Russellian mode of philosophy became associated with modernity. Because of the 1924 debate, where two different sides within Chinese intellectual world emerged, those people interested in dialectical materialism and Marxism sided with the Russellian model. They were constantly even educated at main universities, where the propagators of Russell's model taught. So, as a result of that influence of Russellian philosophy, with which Russell did not agree himself, Russell's philosophy actually became important, actually essential, in development of early Marxism and the broader worldview of Marxist intelligentsia in China during the 1920s and 30s. There is one important historiographical document, remnant, which still exists. You can still access it, which is, there was a rubric published in Dagung Bao, which was edited by Zhang Shenfu and Zhang Daiyan, his younger brother, which propagated the unison, the synthesis between Russellian analytical method, logical analysis, with dialectical materialism. And due to the presence of such discourse at the key universities, at the centers of Chinese intellectual life, we can see influences spreading to Mao Zedong's thought, to the thought of the leading members of the Communist Party. As a result of that, one of the results of that was that mathematical logic was not treated so badly as in China, in socialist China, as it was in other countries. There is another side to this story, to this paradigm I want to thread here. On the side of the people who sided with the tradition, with the view on life, there was also a deep presence of the importance of Russell's philosophy and Russell thought in the formation of modern Chinese philosophy. One such good example is Feng Youlan. Feng Youlan, who, after he returned from the US, and after he learned about the content of the 1924 debate, started writing books on philosophy of life, on the view on life. He wrote a book, Philosophy on a Type of View on Life, which included his own idea of new realist view on life based on Russell's philosophy. In other words, Russell's philosophy was also deeply involved in the formation of idea of modern Chinese philosophy, the roots of modern Chinese philosophy, and even of modern, this is just a side fun fact, of modern Chinese Buddhism. If you have learned about, I don't know whether you know about Dharma Master Taishu. In 1928, Taishu visited UK, and guess whom he met in London? Russell, to discuss about how his idea of modern Buddhism tallies with Russell's mathematical logic. So I don't think I have to say more about paradoxes here at this point. I'm sorry for having too much to say. I have so much to say that I even confuse myself sometimes. Thank you very much for that.
I think maybe we can take a couple couple of questions because we'll have a roundtable afterwards. So hopefully we can come back to and you can maybe come back to whatever you missing side. But maybe like two questions before we move on to the next.
No questions for analytical philosophy?
I was thinking Lee was going to.
But I can.
Sure.
You sort of, my questions, no, let me back up. This is a great talk, thank you. Your questions at the end, or sort of what you were indicating, is that the adoption of Russellian philosophy by sort of dialectical Marxists was paradoxical, as was the adoption of this kind of philosophy by, I guess, classical Chinese philosophers, and there was one other group.
Buddhists as well.
Oh, the Buddhists, right. So I just wanted to say, to me, that doesn't seem paradoxical or counterintuitive, for the reason that maybe looking from my present time, and I work in a place like LSE where analytic philosophy is absolutely dominant.
Yes.
We have a number of Marxists. We have a number of people coming out of the Oxford tradition of Marxism that sees analytic philosophy as very tied to Marxist kinds of goals. Likewise, there's a trend among comparative philosophers now to teach Buddhism as a kind of analytic philosophy because it proceeds logically, right? So I just was observing that from the perspective of philosophy, contemporary philosophy. What they were doing doesn't seem so paradoxical necessarily.
Well, synchronically, maybe not. Diachronically, it does.
Because why? Because Russell wouldn't have seen himself alive.
It's basically because of our tendency to construct diachronical perspectives over that. So we want to have reason, we want to see the reason for what intellectuals in the past were doing. And by so doing, we create concepts and categories into which we want to fit them. It was, in a way, it was a serendipitous manner of adopting everything that came from the West. But by interpreting what was going on, we tend to create clear boundaries, discursive boundaries. So, in a way, you are absolutely right. It should not be paradoxical. But then, the Chinese in 1920s believed that there was a strong discursive boundary, which you cannot overstep. Or if you overstepped it, the world would look totally different. And this created some sort of a necessity to frame either Russell or Husserl or pragmatism or new realism, whatever. And they were struggling with it. And there were many paradoxes. Paradoxes in the sense that people on both sides were propagating Russell, while they were at the same time saying that they don't have the same sources for their convictions. I tend to call this objectivism, a tendency to see some sort of certain kind of ideas as more basic than the others, which creates a leeway to multiple use of ideas like mathematical logic. It's so universal that you can fit it into everything. But this should not be self-evident, I think. Especially when we speak about China. It should not be self-evident that mathematical logic could just jump in and take the way of B or something. They were also struggling with that.
Well, I know Joachim Kutz has written about this, right? And I wrote my first book on Zhang Zizao, who was one of the people that was struggling with the interpretation of logic. Well, what's he? He's the one who has anyway. But I have more to say, but we can leave it at that.
So I think maybe we can leave it here for now and have a few minutes break before we get back to, come back to your presentation. Yeah, it's you.
Now it's you.
Good. Thank you.